Welcome everyone to our domestic violence open house in honor of domestic violence awareness and in tribute to all survivors of interpersonal violence who may be watching, whether through our live event or through the recording that will be available afterwards. My name is Ann David. I'm the current director of clinical services at Jewish Family Services. We have an outpatient mental health at JFS that has existed for a little over 40 years. It consists of licensed clinicians, including licensed clinical social workers who are therapists, licensed professional counselors, clinical trainees, people from different graduate programs who are in training at the clinic, and medication management services at JFS. Who we serve are survivors and clients from across the greater Milwaukee area. We provide psychotherapy services. We provide supportive counseling sessions to people. We provide support groups and consultation as well. At our clinic, we serve out of our offices, at our Jackson Street offices, as well as in school-based settings at different schools in the Milwaukee area. We serve survivors specifically of interpersonal violence at the Sojourner Family Peace Center, including within the Sojourner Truth House. We also still provide remote services via telehealth means. For an idea of our reach within the community, last year we served around 700 clients and provided nearly 10,000 sessions, 1 hour long psychotherapy sessions to people throughout the greater Milwaukee area. That was a 25% increase in what we provided the previous year. A big reason is due to the stress related to the pandemic and due to stress related within certain homes within the greater Milwaukee area, especially the homes of our survivors of intimate partner violence. It was within this program, a specialized program where we provide services to DV survivors, that we saw the greatest increase of services being utilized within our clinic. We have provided services to survivors throughout the history of our clinic, but we really began expanding services these past 3 years. We were able to secure some additional funding through the Office of Crime Victim Services, which is federal funding for survivors of crime. And this additional funding allowed us to expand services to survivors in the Sojourner Truth House additionally, as well as hiring more outpatient therapists. And this happened right on the brink, right before the pandemic broke out in 2020, when we did see a severe increase in services that we provide. This afternoon, we will be having a roundtable discussion of services. We will first hear from our different trauma-informed clinicians that provide these services, as well as additional staff in the program. And then there will be time left over for a question and answer. And why is this event important? This event is very important, not only because October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Really, any month is really important to raise awareness about DV or domestic violence, especially since we've seen such an increase in domestic violence occurrences and severity due to the pandemic. Just for example, in the past year, 2020, Milwaukee saw 50 domestic violence homicides, which was the most domestic violence homicides that Milwaukee has ever experienced. And a lot of this because of the compounding factor of community-based stress, community-based violence, situation going on within homes, children being at school. There's just a pressurization that's been occurring in a lot of homes. And for those survivors who are in a situation where there's domestic violence, it creates the worst scenario possible for a powder keg kind of moment, where we have seen a lot of different extreme forms of violence occurring. And all of our clinicians here, who I'm very fortunate to be working with, have been helping survivors both exit relationships, try to stay safe first and foremost, or heal, if they are currently safe, heal from all of the trauma that they have endured as part of their experiences within the abusive relationships. And when we're talking about domestic violence, domestic abuse, or intimate partner violence, we're referring to types of aggression or abuse that occur within romantic relationships or intimate relationships. IPV can change depending on what the relationship, what the characteristics of the abuser are like, and is different in relationships in terms of how often it happens or how severe it is. Sometimes it can be a single episode, but many times after a couple different episodes of violence occur, those survivors experience ongoing issues of abuse in a relationship. Abuse tactics include physical violence. When we talk about abuse, we're also talking about sexual violence, whether it's attempts to coerce a partner into sex, whether it's forced sex, sexual acts, or whether it's when a partner does not provide consent for sex. Abuse can also be forms of physical aggression or psychological aggression and emotional abuse, where there's verbal and nonverbal behaviors that are occurring by the abuser that serve to demean and disempower the survivor and manipulate and exert control over that person. So those are the different types of experiences that the people that we support go through. And just a quick data point for you all, if you for those of you who have not had to experience this type of violence in a relationship, recent data says about 1 in 4 women and nearly 1 in 10 men have experienced sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner throughout their lifetime. The prevalence rates of that are much higher in the LGBTQ plus community. And we even suspect those prevalence rates are higher because domestic violence often tends to be underreported. So this is why it's really important that you're here for the event to raise awareness, not only about domestic violence, and but also to hear from my esteemed colleagues about how people can heal from these acts. What's going to happen next is each of my colleagues will introduce themselves. They're going to share a little bit of information about their approach or information about partner violence and different forms of healing that can occur. And then at the remainder of the hour, we'll have time for questions and answers. If you would like to submit questions for our presenters, please use the comment section in YouTube or Facebook throughout the presentations, and we will get to those questions and answers at the second half. Now I'd like to introduce you to Chelsea Gilbertson, who is a therapist within our clinic.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chelsea Gilbertson. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in the VOCA program at JFS. Prior to working at JFS, I spent 4 years working in a specialized program for youth survivors of sexual violence. I have about 10 years of experience working with youth and families in various settings, including as a therapist, camp counselor, and swim coach. As a therapist, I specialize in working with children, adults, and families impacted by interpersonal trauma, including sexual abuse and domestic violence. I use many different approaches as a therapist because, of course, no one approach works for everyone. And I'm going to just highlight a couple of approaches that I find myself using often, and I'll share a little bit about them. So with children and families, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT, is a primary modality that I use. So in TFCBT, it's a real flexible multi-step approach. Includes building rapport and a sense of trust and safety, learning about common reactions to stress and trauma and sexual abuse and domestic violence in certain cases, learning about feelings and emotions that live in the body, how to name and tame them, understanding the connection between our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and how those then shift when someone experiences trauma, and safety planning, which can involve learning about internal and external cues of safety and danger, and also systemic safety planning outside of the therapy room. TFCBT can also include, but does not have to include, a trauma narrative or a telling of the story of the abuse or trauma. It is important to note that trauma narrative or telling of the story can look very different for everyone, is never a one-size-fits-all approach or process, and that kids and adults often process trauma in non-linear ways through art, play, and movement. So in my work with children and families, I really try and involve parents and caregivers as much as possible throughout the treatment process when it is safe and appropriate to do so. Because supportive, believing caregivers are hugely important in helping a child to heal from abuse. As many adult survivors of domestic violence are also survivors of childhood trauma, I find that there's a lot of overlap between my approaches in working with children and adult survivors. And one approach I like to use with adults is informed by something called polyvagal theory, which really essentially teaches survivors to befriend their nervous systems, to better understand their needs and attend to those needs, and to find feelings of safety and peace within their bodies. So traumatic experiences can make it really difficult to trust your gut, and it can make it kind of a complicated process. And I believe that all survivors have the capacity to heal, to make choices that honor their need for safety, love, and connection. And in my work with children, families, and adult survivors, I lean into the role of advocate, because I recognize that healing does not happen in a vacuum. Survivors are constantly navigating these systemic challenges, and that can make healing really difficult. So I really put on my advocate hat and try to be flexible in my role as a therapist working with survivors. Understanding systems and legal processes and supporting survivors in navigating like the court process, shelters, different resources that they need for healing is a really important part of our work, I think, as well. So I would say overall, my approach with youth, families, and adults is really empowerment focused, strengths based, body based, and holistic. And I really love working with survivors, and I believe survivors. So now I'm going to pass the microphone to Amber.
Hi, my name is Amber Hibbert. I am also a licensed clinical social worker and a clinical substance abuse counselor. I am also involved in the VOCA program here at JFS. My approach with trauma is on a neurobiological level, really helping people to understand that our experiences do not just exist within our thoughts and emotions, but they exist within our physical body as well. And sometimes the answer is to start within the body and move to connecting the emotions and the thoughts that have also been altered and damaged as a part of the abuse. I use a model called comprehensive resource model, which has been bred out of some models that most people are familiar with these days, such as EMDR or brain spotting. What we learned about 30 years ago with EMDR was that the way our brain transfers information between hemispheres has a lot to do with bilateral stimulation. So if you have heard of EMDR, sometimes people refer to it as, the eye treatment, where you move your eyes back and forth, which it is. And that is for the purpose of allowing our processing to move deeper within our central nervous system. Brain spotting began the process of using just one fixed eye position to allow that processing to move even further within our central nervous system. The goal of processing within the central nervous system, and not just from our cognitive level, is so that that material can actually be reconsolidated in our memory and no longer triggerable. So when we are under extreme stress in these traumatic events, in situations of abuse, our brain kind of gets flooded with cortisol, and parts of our brain that are responsible for consolidating memory properly aren't completely online and aren't working properly. So those memories get kind of separated out and held in different places in different ways within our system. Bringing those back together to have one consolidated memory that is now just a part of our story and no longer held in an unconsolidated way in our body makes it to where it doesn't hold distress and it's no longer triggerable, which is our goal in therapy. Dissociation is one of the defense mechanisms that comes up a lot in survivors and in all of us, really. So if you're not familiar with that term, dissociation means to separate, right? So we separate ourselves to protect different parts of ourselves in a lot of different ways. So sometimes we protect ourselves from our own emotions. If you've ever had the experience of just feeling completely numb, I know I should be feeling something right now and I don't, right? That would be dissociation from affect or emotion. Sometimes we have a situation where we don't feel our physical body, right? Like, I know that something is touching me, but I don't feel it. Dissociation occurs on a spectrum. Right? We all dissociate, every one of us, whether we've experienced trauma or not. So some of those more mild experiences of dissociation that we may be familiar with are like daydreaming. You know, you have been in your own thoughts, and reality around you has continued to move on, and you have not been aware of the passage of time for the last 5 or 10 minutes. Or highway hypnosis, right? You take the same route home from work every day, and one day you look up and say, oh, I'm turning onto my street. I didn't realize I got off the interstate, right? These are small ways that dissociation shows up. It's a disconnection from the present moment, from our present awareness. We've heard people talk about dissociation in a way of feeling like the outer body experience, where I kind of felt like I was watching something happen. Couldn't feel it in my body. Wasn't there connected to it emotionally. It was like I was watching something on TV, right? So as difficult as dissociation may be to understand, it's actually an incredibly protective experience that our brain does all by itself. So it's not something that we have to feel shame or blame about. It's something that is meant to protect our system from complete and utter overwhelm. Right? If I was in an accident and my hand was being hurt, somatic dissociation would help me through that experience if I wasn't able to tolerate that. Right? So it's not something that's done wrong or is about blame. It's something that is protective. We treat dissociation when it becomes life interfering, when it starts to become so automatic in our system, or we're so triggered all the time that it's interfering with us being able to actually participate in our life, in our relationships, in the way in which we want to. So our treatment goals would consist of, first of all, becoming aware of how we dissociate, when we dissociate, and how it's impacting our life. Starting to get oriented back to the present, reoriented back to our body, reoriented back to feeling. When we've been through prolonged trauma, like a domestic violence relationship, we may have disconnected from our feelings long ago in order to survive that. So reconnecting with our feelings can be kind of a scary thing in general. Even the thought of having to remember or work on our trauma or address trauma in therapy can be intimidating and a scary process, because we don't want to remember sometimes because it was so bad or it was so scary. Staying grounded in the present moment and oriented to the present so that we are not back fully in the past is a way that we can more safely explore and remember and reincorporate those memories in a way that's not re-traumatizing or damaging. So grounding skills, resourcing skills, and orientation to the present will be our first goals if we're working with some dissociation that's come up in trauma. So with that, I would like to introduce Ms. Patrice.
Hello, everyone. My name is Patrice MacBeth, and I'm a licensed professional counselor that specializes in trauma. Prior to working at JFS, I spent time working in the human services field. And prior to that, after that, I worked as in a specialized program for youth survivors of sexual violence. And following that, I also worked as a child and family therapist, servicing women and their children in an evidence-based recovery residential facility. Here at JFS, I work part-time in the outpatient clinic, delivering a brief intervention form of therapy, as well as an emergency services to ensure that survivors are seen in a timely manner. In this approach, we attempt to have appointments available sooner rather than later, offering in those first appointments is stabilization, crisis and stabilization within 10 to 12 sessions. Clients are then provided the option to stay on as a client, be referred to another therapist that's in-house, or referred to another agency with warm handoffs. By doing this, we feel that it will help increase recidivism as well as continuity of care. In this model, we focus on safety and stabilization in those first few sessions and coping to help clients understand what they've experienced within that traumatic situation and help them provide safety within themselves and within their environment and understand new coping techniques to get through what they're experiencing. The rest of the time, I work with the survivors of domestic violence in collaboration with the Sojourner Truth House, doing individual sessions in psychoeducation groups, addressing healthy and unhealthy relationships, boundaries, coping skills, just to name a few topics. Some of the approaches that I use working with survivors, I'm very holistic in how I do things because no two people are the same. I use motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and comprehensive resource model as well, CRM. With motivational interviewing, it helps individuals find their internal motivation and decrease their insecurities and uncertainty that they may experience after having those traumatic events happen. With CBT, I like to work with the individuals on learning ways to identify those destructive ways of thinking that are disturbing, the destructive and disturbing thought patterns that have a negative influence on their behaviors and their emotions. And when we break those up, sometimes people can find a little bit of hope as they're continuing to move through their process. With CRM, it uses, as Amber was talking about, it uses a variety of resources to access and address the emotional trauma that's within by using some breath work, neurobiology, and body resourcing. And like I said before, I work holistically with clients because I feel like no two people are the same, and we need to meet people where they're at to help them along their healing journey. On to you, Leah.
Hi, I'm Leah. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm the Jewish community advocate here at JFS. And so for what that means for me as an advocate, I really focus on empowerment, and the work that I do is informed by empowerment theory. And kind of how I like to think about it. Something I heard recently is that advocates don't empower people, but create the space for self-empowerment. And that's really how I like to think about myself. So when somebody comes and meets with me for the first time, I kind of approach it as like, I am here for you, whatever it is that you identify that you need. Like that's what I'm here to support you with. And so that can be navigating systems and connecting with resources. It can be building on skills, and those sorts of things as well. And so that's really what that part is about. And then the Jewish part of my Jewish community advocate is, in this context, really thinking about the some of the special issues that might come up around interpersonal violence and domestic violence in the Jewish community, and how Jewish values and tradition can play into it. And so there's one value in particular that I like to highlight in this, and that's of Shalom Bayit, which means peace of the home. And it really is like what it sounds like, of like this ideal of having a home that is peaceful and warm and welcoming and loving. However, it's also often used against survivors. And this could be in terms of like dismissing their stories, and like, oh, if Jews if we value Shalom Bayit, then there's no domestic violence in the Jewish community because we value peace in the home. Or also in victim blaming of like, it's your fault that you're not the one maintaining Shalom Bayit, this peace. Or if you leave, then you're breaking Shalom Bayit. And kind of my work in that is shifting that framework of it's not the survivor's fault. The peace of the home was already broken long before the person tries to leave. It's broken at the first instance of abuse. And really, in thinking about that and working that, just shifting that narrative in order to just allow survivors and encourage survivors to just feel more at home in who they are and still feel like they're being their true and authentic selves as Jews and as well as survivors. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as I was sitting here in the back room, watching all of you speak and hearing about your approaches to healing, I just want to say that I feel really privileged to work alongside each and every one of you, even though we're technically not in the same room right now. Even though you're hearing different approaches from each of our practitioners and staff, I think it's evident to you all as well as myself that the people at JFS really have intention and clarity in terms of their approach with working with survivors. Even though I'm director of the clinic, I still also am practicing as a therapist, specializing in working with people who are survivors of childhood abuse. But I can tell you that it gets really hard sometimes to see clear through when sitting with people and sitting within their space and the pain that they're holding. It can be hard to see clearly through to what as healers we need to do to help this person or create a space for them to survive the pain in their body, survive the pain emotionally that they're going through, even like survive the moment. So it was very much so a privilege to hear you all clearly talk about what anchors you in your approach to working with survivors, which can be some very difficult work. We have time for questions and answers right now. So just a reminder, if you do have questions for any of our presenters, to please put that in Facebook Live chat or YouTube comments, and we can get to those questions. As I read these off, just anyone, just informally, if you want to speak to the community about and answer any question, please feel free to just jump on and start talking. This is more of an informal part of our presentation. Our first question is this: COVID-19 has been linked to an increase in interpersonal violence. Can you expand on possible reasons for this? What do y'all think?
I can chime in. I think some of the reasons are the confinement to the home and the change in roles, increased poverty with loss of jobs and income, and having children in the home more constantly, having increased responsibility with schooling, parenting, and work. And then just the baseline increased anxiety and health fear that we all experienced, worrying about your children being sick, maybe disagreements in the home between partners about how to handle the pandemic and how to keep yourselves and your children safe. Those are all factors that have added additional conflict within homes lately.
The only thing that popped into my mind as Amber was talking about the increase in violence that we're seeing. When you said about being alone in the home or in the home, we've seen that a lot as well, just within our service industry, just as therapists. We notice that it is harder for people to stay socially connected when everyone's remote, working from home. If you lose your job and you're at home, but then we're not going out as much socially. One main tactic to abuse and that abusers often use early on is social isolation. Whether that's through just manipulative statements about people that are like really crucial to the family or social fabric of people's lives, just gradually beginning to tease away at those relationships psychologically, making the person doubt others, or whether it's literally through physical threats of physical violence or physical violence about people's decisions to be social, that thereby isolates the victim, keeping them separate. COVID made all of that way more pronounced. And so potential safety net or protective factors that were available pre-COVID that might have kept some more severe or increased the frequency of abuse, or kept certain types of abuse at bay, abuse and other tactics really accelerated more rapidly in situations due to the social isolation of what's going on. So I think that's one factor that was at play as well. We have another question. In addition to therapy or counseling, are there any other resources out there for survivors of domestic violence?
Yes. So I am not a therapist. I'm not a counselor. I'm not licensed in either of these things. And, like I said before, my role is as an advocate, and a lot of that is around finding resources, connecting with resources, navigating the systems, and building on skills that you already have. And so that's really what my role is about, as opposed to some of the therapy that we offer as well.
Great. Yes, and we're very happy to have Leah here too, as well. Leah's our new community-based advocate, has been with us for just a couple of months. And so if it's yourself or if it's someone that you love who is in need of services, but is earlier on, the idea of therapy or counseling or anything like that really puts them off to help or seek help. If it's really just talking to somebody more informally, what Leah would do as an advocate is really meet them right where they're at, just in the form of having a conversation and about what they're going through, and explore all of their different options. So Leah's a good inroad for that approach, for a resource that isn't necessarily counseling or therapy. Next question, how does your approach change with a survivor who has left their abuser versus someone who is still in the relationship?
I think what Patrice said about meeting someone where they are is incredibly important. Even if you, as a therapist or a person in a supportive role, doesn't feel the way that that person does about their relationship, you really need to try and understand and support them exactly where they are, which is, I think, key. And then, when someone is no longer in a relationship, you're looking at kind of healing from the impact of being in that relationship. So, you're doing a little bit of a balancing act, looking at what are the things that are keeping this individual connected to this person. What are the things that individual is providing for them? Because there's reasons why they're staying in that relationship. And if we don't acknowledge those reasons, then that's really going to make that person pull away from us as well. So we have to really understand what are maybe some of the benefits of staying in that relationship? What are some of the things that relationship provides for that person? While also understanding that there are some unsafe aspects of that relationship. So it's kind of doing a little bit of a dance. I would say when someone is in the relationship, and then when they've left the relationship, you're kind of looking at how they've been impacted, and is this impacting future relationships and their emotions, and just how they're trying to live their life, trying to move forward.
And to piggyback off of what Chelsea was just saying, we operate as non-judgmental, because like Chelsea was just saying, you don't know what the ramifications of leaving for that person in that moment is. So when we're dealing with people who are still in the relationship, there is a lot of safety planning that's involved. And if they're planning on leaving, sometimes it has to be a strategic way for them to leave, because leaving like on a whim can cause death in some cases. So you can't just expect for people to leave. And also, like Chelsea said, if it's a financial abuse situation where the victim does not have any finances to go anywhere, or basically any place to go, then sometimes people are trying to balance those things out and figure out what the next steps are. And being a supportive person, even if you're a friend or a family member, leaving the judgment out of it and supporting them where they're at and providing encouragement to help them move forward in whichever way they feel is best for their life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think the only addition to that, like when I hear that question too, how does your approach change when working with a survivor who is still in a relationship with an abusive partner versus someone who has left? Something that Amber was talking about before in terms of how we protect ourselves when there are traumatic events occurring around us or to our bodies. Amber was talking about dissociation. So dissociation is a process of disconnect or separation, and is protective, and one that is protective. So even though I might be dissociatively spacing out or switching or numbing or having a lot of numbing of my emotions or having a lot of presentations that can look like depression, what I'm doing potentially is functionally protecting myself from a lot of trauma that's been built up in my body, somatically, or traumatic memories that are built up within my mind from times when I might have been near death, from times when I might have experienced a lot of physical pain, from moments that are too tender and too traumatizing to recall. If a child was in the room watching an incident occur, the ability to protect your brain from all of that content, that information, allows people to stay functional, even though we might judge what functional looks like. If it looks depressed, they're functioning as best as they can. If they're still in a relationship with an abuser, and as a therapist, you try to go towards emotionally processing some of the trauma that they're still going through, depending on how you're approaching it, you could begin to work with dissociative processes that are still being protective. It's often that we don't get to trauma processing and working with certain types of dissociation until after that person is safe and away from their abuser, or it's a safer place to start addressing those protective dissociative processes. So that's another way that things might look different. Is trauma processing is approached a little bit differently. Not to say that if you're someone who is done, it's safe now, is not with a partner anymore, and it's been 10 years, not to say that we would jump into trauma processing with you. It's still done in the ways that both Chelsea and Patrice allude to. We meet you where you're at, whatever pace you need to go at, we will meet you there and talk about it transparently. We don't jump into trauma processing for people who are safely out of a relationship. It's all done in partnership with safety in mind, both safety physically in your external environments, as well as safety internally, waiting for when you're ready to talk about some of the more harrowing parts of your experience.
Yeah.
Okay. Indigenous women experience the highest rate of IPV, or intimate partner violence, followed by African American women. Are you serving individuals representing these populations, and what, if any, barriers exist in helping them? So yes, I can say that we do serve. We do serve. Of those nearly 700 people in the clinic, and I believe about nearly 300 of those individuals we served came from the program where we specialize in serving people who are survivors of intimate partner violence, various forms of partner violence. We do serve African American women as well as Indigenous women. The first thing that pops in my mind in terms of barriers, people who come from under-resourced communities tend to be people who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, just due to systemic issues within our country, due to systemic racism. So when you're under-resourced, it can be harder to find out about services that are available to you. You might not have as ready access to information that might be available to you. specific systemic barriers that we have witnessed particularly in this program are that a lot of and I'll say predominantly of the mothers that we're serving, of the African American mothers that we serve, there's a higher percentage of those people who are involved in child protective services, so there's systems involved, than of people who are non-African American. And what that means is there's a barrier in terms of distrust in systems in general. And the mental health system or therapy often is associated with the medical model or mental health system, because honestly, therapists, we have been a part of a very medical model, medically based system for a big part of our history, at least especially our recent history. We have this kind of industrial complex often about behavioral health or mental health. Even though our therapists in this program and in all of JFS definitely don't operate neatly within that model, we meet our clients where they're at, we're still often viewed as being part of a system that disproportionately discriminates and impacts African American and Indigenous women. So, and there's a lot of stigma often amongst women to seek help within these communities. So there are definitely system barriers that survivors from communities, BIPOC communities face. And in addition to a long history of systemic traumas that often are a part of their experience. So they're walking in not only having dealt with partner violence, maybe even childhood situations of trauma, but also with systemic trauma. So there's ongoing systems issues occurring, but then there's also past trauma that is often needing to be processed as part of systemic trauma. Next question. What experiences do people have working with queer and particularly non-binary, GNC, and trans clients? So particularly non-binary, gender non-conforming, and transgender client survivors. Also, can you address the idea formulated by scholar, lawyer, professor Kimberly Crenshaw on intersectionality and how that informs therapy? Sounds good. So Kimberly Crenshaw is a lawyer out of UCLA, I believe, who introduced a feminist scholar and theorist around who introduced the idea of intersectionality, which is that we don't exist simply as a singular identity. I'm not just a woman. I'm not just white. I'm not just over here. My experiences can't be compartmentalized across different parts of my identity. Every single one of those, every single parts of my identity impact my own experiences in society. All of my identities impact it. And you can't really look at me as just one or the other. And so the question of the person is, can you address the idea formulated by Kimberly Crenshaw, how that informs therapy? So let me repose that question to all the therapists. When you're working with a survivor who has a perceived identity or ascribed identity as whether it's trans or non-binary or gender non-conforming, and is walking into the room, your therapy office, with a lot of different experiences, not only of the partner violence that they've experienced, but similar to what I was saying before, a lot of the other additional traumas that they've experienced in their life because of their different intersections of their identities. How does this get worked into therapy?
Mm-hmm.
I think that you said it right there. It's that there are all of these underlying traumas that cannot be ignored, and they shape the way that we have learned to be in relationship with people. They shape the way that we've learned to be in relationship with ourselves. They've shaped our belief system that we operate from, and all of those things are important as we work through our current traumas as well. And as a therapist and partner in that journey, it's our responsibility to understand how those things have impacted this particular individual, their particular framework, not my framework, their framework. Because if you don't ask, then you really don't know. And we can make assumptions about it, but that doesn't typically get us anywhere good. So we really need to be open about those things. We need to not shy away from those intersections and really ask and be curious together with our client about how those different pathways in life and different experiences and different ways of being in relationship have formed where they're at today. I don't think it's something that can be ignored. I think that would be neglectful.
Mm-hmm.
I also agree with Amber about that, because we do have to honor. My biggest thing is about honoring the person and their experiences when we're working with people. We can't ignore any part of any person. And so as we're dealing with clients, for me personally, I look at the entire individual, not just pieces. Well, looking at them as an individual and not making, like Amber was saying, not making any assumptions about who they are or how they live, and allowing them to come into the space as they are, and inviting them, making the environment peaceful enough for them to operate and be their true authentic selves without feeling judged in the center of their trauma.
And I do hear an important part in this question as well. And one of these questions from the commenter: what experiences do people have working with queer and particularly non-binary, gender non-conforming, or trans clients and survivors? It is really important because, especially amongst the queer community, especially GNC and trans folks, it's going to be important that they know kind of the past experience of their therapist. So if anyone wants to just take about 15 to 30 seconds just to step forward real quick and just mention the experience you have working within the community. Just in case there's a survivor out there wanting to know if there's any specific trans or GNC experience they maybe have.
I have a few that's currently on my caseload that identify as gender nonconforming.
My experience has mostly been with queer and trans youth. So, yeah.
I've worked with queer and non-binary.
I'm not a therapist, but to chime in, I have also worked with some queer youth. I'm also a queer person myself. And prior to working at JFS, when I was a student at Brandeis, I worked for the Student Sexuality Information Service. And so there I provided a lot of peer support to queer individuals, including non-binary individuals and trans individuals on, any of the things that might come up for them, and feeling comfortable in their bodies and being their authentic selves.
Thank you. Next question. There is a higher risk of harm as well as a higher risk of death when a survivor leaves. What steps must a survivor consider in making an exit plan, and what resources do you offer? So let's start with that first question. What steps must a survivor consider in making an exit plan when they make that decision to leave high lethality situation?
I can start with that. I think that they need someone that they can join with in planning that, and impulsive and abrupt separations are oftentimes more high risk. So having some support people identified, having a way to make sure that you have access to your important documents, your driver's license, your social security card, your birth certificates and medical cards for your kids, all of those things need to be considered. They can all be replaced. That is true. And that is a lot of extra work to do as you are transitioning and rebuilding for your family and trying to get kids re-enrolled in school and seeking employment and all of those things. So having someone work with you in planning some of those steps is important. how to safely and discreetly get some of those things out of the house and returned in a way that is safe, how to make maybe additional keys to things, cars and homes, and get the originals returned safely is something to think about. Having certain things stored at a trusted family member's home ahead of time, a little bit at a time, is important. Just knowing where you can go, one of those places is Sojourner Family Peace Center Shelter, or the Women's Center as well. So working with an advocate like Leah, or a therapist that can get you connected with those services, is a really important place to start.
Yeah. And I'm happy, Amber, that you mentioned Sojourner Family Peace Center. That's one of the great partnerships that we have as part of the services we provide to survivors as a resource. Because when a survivor is in a highly lethal situation, there are certain factors that forensically a high lethality advocate would look for that certain situations hold in common, but there's also going to be peculiarities or nuances per situation or relationship. As part of our partnership with Sojourner, our therapist and our team does have access to advocates who, and they have their own consultation group over there for high-risk DV cases, where we can consult with people without providing your or our clients identifying information. We can talk about the situation that the person is in and certain nuances of what's going on to get information on how best to help and support our clients in situations where there's a high risk of lethality. Okay. We do have one final question. Do we offer support groups, offer group sessions or support groups? And what are the benefit of those? Currently, we do offer some groups within the Sojourner Truth House. Patrice, do you want to talk a little bit about the group that you provide within the shelter there?
Yes, in shelter, we have a psychoeducation group that meets once a week. We work with survivors on identifying what domestic violence is, because sometimes people think domestic violence is physical violence only, and we identify the other ways that domestic violence shows up. We also, within that group, we talk about healthy and unhealthy relationship, learning new ways to set boundaries, coping skills. And if the ladies or residents, because it's not just ladies anymore in the shelter, if the residents have questions about other things, I bring forth that information so that they can get the support they need in that way. We also talk about building a social network, because most of the time when you've experienced domestic violence, your social network isn't as big as it used to be. Like, you may not have a lot of friends or family support. So understanding who's in your community that can help you, just learning how to be social again and getting other people in your life and building that network up. And we also do a group that is with art. So there's a topic, it could be about boundaries, and we create some type of art that relates to that. Because a lot of people don't do well with just talk therapy or in groups in that form. So sometimes art groups can help people process things a lot better. So we're trying to work and build more things that are available to the residents.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Alrighty. Well, I appreciate all of my colleagues and presenters that were here today. And I want to thank everyone who joined us live for this event and who might be listening to this recording, especially to survivors out there that might currently be in a situation where they are at risk day to day, or where even like the abuse might be beginning within your relationship, or maybe you've been stuck in a dangerous relationship for many years. We are here for you. Even if that relationship ended 10, 20 years ago and you're still haunted by some of the memories of that relationship, JFS is here for you. Every single person on this call, I know, is incredibly devoted to the clients that they work with. And I'm glad that you got to meet some of the colleagues that I work with that I'm very privileged to work with every single day. I had the opportunity and privilege to travel to a country where that was that had an experience of colonization. And I just want to end by sharing a quote. It's a centuries old quote that goes like this: always remember in your heart those three things: whence you come, who you are, and what shall become of you. So this quote was alleged to be the first words written in English by a religious clergy in the years following an invasion from colonists that include swift and brutal raiding of villages. And when I heard that quote, and I was thinking about our presentation today and survivors and what you all might be going through and what our therapists try to do to support, that quote really stood out to me. Remember in your heart three things: whence you come, who you are, and what shall become of you. When survivors, when you endure just a fracturing of yourself because of the violence and what you endure on a day-to-day basis, it can be very easy for us to forget where we come from, who we are, and what shall become of ourselves. All of the people here today are with you in that journey and are very devoted to helping you to create that space to remember who you are, where you come from, and what shall become of you. So JFS is here for you. We would be very honored to journey with you on that path to regaining those three parts of yourself again. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you're interested in more services. You can contact our clinical services coordinator, Kat. You can call 414-225-1374. And if there's anything urgent that you are going through or a loved one is experiencing violence, that's urgent. Sojourner does have a 24-hour crisis line as well at 414-933-2722. And you can find that information online as well. So thank you for joining us, and I hope you all take care and have a nice evening.